The Pacific Islands in 1943 and 1944 were landscapes carved by coral, hardened by volcanic stone, and turned into fortresses by men who believed no force on Earth could pry them out. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, names that to American Marines meant weeks of mud, blood, and fire. For the Japanese defenders, these islands were more than battlegrounds. They were shrines of honor, dug deep with pillboxes, caves, and underground tunnels built to withstand the heaviest naval barrages and the most relentless air attacks. Every inch of coral was turned into concrete. Every cave mouth was reinforced with steel and timber. Grenades would bounce uselessly off the walls. Mortar rounds rattled the ceilings, but the defenders sat safe in their strongholds, convinced that no enemy could touch them. Among these defenders, there was laughter. It wasn't the laughter of men at ease, but of soldiers who believed themselves invincible. When they caught sight of the strange, bulky equipment slung across the backs of advancing American infantrymen, they mocked openly. A pair of steel cylinders strapped to a Marine's shoulders, with a long hose and nozzle dangling in his hand. It looked clumsy, heavy, and ridiculous. Japanese propaganda spread through the ranks, calling these men walking bombs, suggesting that one well-placed bullet could ignite the tanks and turn the operator into a pillar of fire. The joke made the rounds in the dugouts and trenches. Why waste ammunition on a flamethrower? Just wait for him to trip, and he'll burn himself alive. From their positions in coral bunkers and pillboxes, the defenders watched with confidence. They could hear the grinding approach of American tanks. They could see the waves of Marines advancing across the beachheads. Artillery had shaken the ground for hours, and yet when the dust settled, their fortifications still stood. Machine guns opened fire from narrow slits in the pillboxes, cutting down men in open ground. Snipers from hidden ridges picked off Marines as they crawled forward. The Americans hurled grenades, but the blasts were swallowed by thick walls. Rifle fire echoed across the beaches, ineffective against stone. The bunkers seemed eternal proof of Japanese engineering and the belief that courage and discipline could outlast any foreign invader. For the Marines storming those beaches, frustration grew like a fever. They were trained to advance, to overwhelm, but here every assault seemed to break against an impenetrable wall. Men were pinned down on the sand for hours, unable to move. Entire squads were wiped out trying to get close to a single firing slit. Officers shouted orders, artillery shells crashed, smoke screens drifted, and still the bunkers held. The Americans were bleeding for every yard of ground, and it was clear that rifles and grenades alone could not win this kind of fight. Inside the bunkers, the Japanese defenders mocked what they could not yet understand. They jeered as Marines with the heavy flame tanks staggered forward, silhouetted against the smoke and the surf. From a distance, they looked vulnerable, easy prey for a rifleman's bullet. Some defenders even called them cowards, thinking that fire was a weapon for men afraid to fight face to face. The confidence of the Japanese infantry seemed unshakable, their laughter echoing through the tunnels, their voices raised above the crack of gunfire. To them, the flamethrower was not a weapon to fear, but a curiosity to dismiss. Their faith rested in stone and steel, in their belief that no fire could reach them in the dark, narrow heart of their caves. But for the Americans pinned down on those beaches, watching comrades fall against unbreakable defenses, the laughter was not heard. What they saw instead was the growing necessity for a weapon different from anything else in their arsenal, something that could reach inside a bunker and strip away the illusion of safety, something that would turn confidence into terror. And though the Japanese did not yet know it, those strange, bulky tanks on a Marine's back carried the answer, one that would silence the laughter in an instant. The M2 flamethrower was a weapon that demanded both strength and courage. Weighing nearly 70 pounds when fully loaded, it was no ordinary rifle or carbine. The man carrying it became a slow-moving target, a walking silhouette outlined by the steel cylinders on his back. Cylinders filled with volatile fuel that could ignite with a single lucky enemy bullet. Every Marine knew the truth whispered in the ranks. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in combat was often measured in minutes. Few volunteered for the role. Most were chosen, handed the weapon, and told simply, "This is what the mission requires." Training with the flamethrower was brutal. Men had to learn how to balance the heavy tanks across uneven ground, how to manage the unwieldy nozzle, how to calculate fuel bursts measured in seconds, not minutes. They practiced on wooden bunkers built on training grounds, watching the weapons reach turned plywood into blackened husks. But practice was nothing like war. No one could replicate the sensation of crawling through mud and sand while tracer rounds snapped overhead, knowing that one stumble might mean a fiery death. It was a job for men who had already accepted the possibility they might not survive the day. On Saipan, that day came. The Marines hit the beaches under a rain of fire. Japanese defenders dug deep into pillboxes carved from coral and reinforced with concrete, poured bullets and mortar rounds into the surf. The sand churned with shrapnel. Smoke and dust rolled across the shoreline, and men dropped flat, pinned against the earth with nowhere to run. From the bunkers, mocking voices rang out in broken English and in Japanese. They called the flamethrower men cowards, walking torches, and shouted insults, daring them to come closer. To the defenders, the men burdened with heavy tanks were easy prey, targets that would never reach the bunkers alive. But one Marine kept moving. His name lost to history, his story repeated only in fragments. He pushed forward with the weight of fire strapped to his back. Bent low, he crawled over sand already blackened by explosions. Machine gun rounds tore the air around him, sparks kicking up where bullets struck coral fragments. His comrades fired suppressing bursts, drawing enemy fire away for a few seconds at a time. Still, every yard was agony. His boots sank into churned mud, his uniform soaked with sweat and salt water. The flamethrower nozzle shook in his hands, not from fear alone, but from the sheer exhaustion of carrying death on his shoulders. The Japanese soldiers inside the nearest bunker continued to jeer, certain that the man would collapse before reaching their firing slit. Their confidence grew louder as bullets spattered the ground within inches of his crawling figure. For them, this was entertainment, a cruel game played from the safety of their fortifications. They had no idea that their laughter was about to end. The Marine reached the mouth of the bunker. He rose halfway, bracing himself behind a shattered tree trunk. With a steadying breath, he squeezed the trigger on the nozzle. The weapon came alive with a roar that drowned out rifles and machine guns alike. A jet of flame burst forward, a stream of burning liquid fuel that reached nearly 150 feet. In an instant, the bunker that had resisted grenades and artillery erupted in a firestorm. Flames rolled inside the pillbox, sucking the oxygen from its narrow chamber. The laughter turned to screams, muffled by smoke. Ammunition boxes stacked in the corners began to detonate one by one, each explosion feeding the inferno until the entire stronghold was consumed. For the Marines pinned down on the beach, the sight was shocking and liberating at once. Where minutes earlier there had been endless gunfire and mockery, Now there was silence and black smoke pouring from the shattered bunker. The weapon that had been ridiculed, the men who had been mocked, had just broken open a fortress that nothing else could touch. Before we continue, let me ask, where are you watching this from? Drop your country in the comments. That single burst of fire became a symbol for what the flamethrower could do. It was not just a weapon, it was a key, one that could unlock the most stubborn defenses. The Japanese would never laugh so freely at the sight of flame tanks again. On Saipan, and in every Pacific battle that followed, the Marines carrying the M2 became both the most hunted men on the battlefield and the most feared. Across the Pacific, the weapon that had once been ridiculed turned into one of the most decisive instruments of war. The flamethrower was no longer an oddity or a curiosity. It was the only tool that could crack open fortresses the Japanese had sworn were impenetrable. Each new campaign seemed to reinforce the same lesson: bunkers, caves, and pillboxes could resist bombs, shells, and grenades, but not fire. On Peleliu, the battle stretched across jagged coral ridges that the Marines grimly nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against them, filled with hidden crevices and honeycombed tunnels. Japanese defenders had spent months transforming the island into a labyrinth of fire points, machine gun nests, and concealed cave systems. When artillery barrages lifted, the defenders simply re-emerged from their tunnels, unharmed and ready to fight again. Rifle squads and grenadiers were helpless against such positions, but the flamethrower changed everything. Marines crawled up those ridges with 70 pounds of fuel strapped to their backs, flames shooting into the mouths of caves. Inside, the results were horrific: flames sucking oxygen from the air, smoke filling chambers, and defenders dying not just by fire but by suffocation. What had been a fortress one moment became a tomb the next. Survivors began whispering about this weapon, no longer mocking it but dreading its hiss and roar. Then came Iwo Jima, one of the most iconic battles of the Pacific War. The black volcanic sand slowed every advance, and the island itself was riddled with more than 11 miles of interconnected tunnels. Japanese soldiers believed their underground strongholds could withstand any assault. Artillery thundered for days, naval guns poured thousands of shells into the island, but the bunkers and tunnels endured. Only the flamethrower could reach inside those narrow mouths of darkness. Marines advanced bunker by bunker, often with entire squads providing covering fire just to keep a single flamethrower operator alive long enough to reach the target. Many didn't make it. Operators drew every bullet, every sniper's eye. The moment the Japanese saw the twin tanks strapped to a Marine's back, he became the primary target. Yet those who survived long enough to trigger their weapons turned the tide of battle. Eyewitnesses spoke of moments when one Marine with a flamethrower did what no platoon with rifles could achieve. A burst of fire into a tunnel would clear out dozens of defenders in seconds. On Iwo Jima, flamethrowers were used so heavily that tanks were outfitted with flame projectors, belching gouts of fire into caves while infantry closed in behind them. The sight alone was enough to terrify defenders. Men who had once shouted insults from pillbox slits now fell silent when they saw the nozzle lowered toward their hiding place. Fire did more than kill, it crushed morale. It carried with it a psychological weight that bullets never could. Okinawa was the final, bitter proof. The hillsides were honeycombed with caves, artillery positions, and defensive strongholds that turned every advance into a nightmare. The Japanese defenders fought with fanatical determination, but by then they no longer dismissed the flamethrower. They feared it above all else. Trapped in their dugouts, they could hear the hiss of fuel and the roar of ignition before the fire even reached them. Survivors described the terror of watching flames roll toward them, filling every corner, leaving no space untouched. Smoke blinded, heat suffocated, and in moments the position was gone. The Americans had found the one weapon that made hiding useless. For the Marines, flamethrower operators became both heroes and martyrs. They were celebrated in the ranks, yet every man knew the job came with a price. Covering fire was poured out in waves, entire squads sacrificing themselves just to protect the one man carrying the flame. Some operators became legends, awarded the Medal of Honor for actions that defied belief. On Iwo Jima, Marine Herschel Woody Williams carried his flamethrower through hours of battle, repeatedly charging pillboxes that had stopped entire companies. Alone, he eliminated multiple enemy strongholds, his actions opening the way for the advance. Stories like his became symbols of the brutal heroism of flame warfare. But for every medal, there were countless men who never returned. Their tanks exploded under enemy fire, or they were cut down before reaching their targets. The risk was staggering, and yet the Marines knew there was no other way. Every assault relied on them. Every victory in the Pacific was written in part by their fire. By 1945, the Japanese had stopped laughing. Where once they had mocked the walking bombs, now the mere sight of a man carrying those steel cylinders could drain their confidence. A weapon that had been dismissed as impractical had become the most feared presence on the battlefield. It was not just fire. It was the collapse of every illusion of safety they had built inside their bunkers and caves. In the aftermath of those island campaigns, the lesson was undeniable. Japanese confidence in their bunkers and caves had been shattered by a weapon they once scorned. The fortifications, built with months of labor, reinforced with steel and coral, were never truly safe. Grenades might rattle their walls, artillery might scar their surface, but fire could seep inside. It needed no open door. It crawled through firing slits, rolled across ceilings, and devoured the air itself. Against that, there was no countermeasure, no bravery that could save a garrison once the flames rushed in. The flamethrower became the grim equalizer, the answer to the problem of fortifications that cost so many lives in the opening months of the Pacific War. Yet the weapon's effectiveness was matched only by its brutality. Even among Marines, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of what it meant to use one. Rifles killed at a distance, artillery shattered from afar. Fire consumed everything in its path, leaving charred bodies and suffocated soldiers behind. It was not just a military instrument, it was a psychological hammer, both for those who faced it and those who wielded it. Some operators spoke of the nightmares it left them with, the images of men clawing at walls inside burning caves. Others admitted they never felt like heroes, only survivors who had done what had to be done. And yet, in the desperate conditions of jungle and island warfare, it was the only way forward. Every advance through Peleliu's ridges, Iwo Jima's tunnels, Okinawa's hillsides had been made possible by the men who strapped on those tanks of fuel and walked toward fire. Without them, assaults would have stalled, casualties would have multiplied, and victory might have taken far longer. They were the embodiment of American innovation and grim necessity, a weapon born of desperation but wielded with resolve. The image remains stark. A Japanese squad that once laughed at the sight of a walking torch, now silenced forever. Their bunker reduced to blackened stone and smoking ruins. Where voices once mocked, only the crackle of fire remained. The flamethrower, dismissed at first as impractical and suicidal, had become the weapon that burned through the Pacific and rewrote the fate of battles. When the war ended, the world reconsidered what it had witnessed. Flamethrowers had done their job, but their very nature branded them inhumane. In the years that followed, militaries across the globe began to phase them out. By the Vietnam era, their use was rare, and later they disappeared from official arsenals altogether. The weapon's legacy was too brutal, too horrifying to endure in modern combat. But in the Pacific theater of World War II, they were indispensable. They were the fire that cracked open caves, the roar that silenced laughter, the terror that made men abandon the belief that any fortress was invincible. In that crucible of coral and volcanic stone, where every inch of ground had to be paid for in blood, the flamethrower was the weapon that made victory possible. It was feared, it was hated, and it was unforgettable. Flamethrower operators often had the shortest life expectancy on the battlefield. What would drive someone to take such a role? Duty, courage, or desperation?